what is your best advice on how people can form a framework of tools that they can actually use?
Well, I think you have to start with the objective. So everything I talk about, I've always talked about this way, or at least for more than a decade, and I certainly have written the book through this lens, which is you go from objective to strategy to tactics. So we always want to start with the objective, and I do think it's worth being clear for any individual what their objective is. If you're trying to play this sort of long game, you have to work backwards and say, okay, what do you want to be true at the end of your life? And the framework that I use for that is called the marginal decade. So the marginal decade is the last decade of your life. Everyone will have a marginal decade. And that's not a pleasant thought for many of us to think about, right? I don't love thinking about the fact that I'm going to have a marginal decade, but I will. Now, you never know the day you enter your marginal decade. But many people know when they are in it. And the question then becomes, what do you want to be true in that decade? And by the way, this is a valuable exercise because I don't think a lot of people do this. But I think everybody needs to do this and needs to go really far down the rabbit hole. So that's how you start. You start with the objective, you reverse engineer what the implication of each objective is. Mm-hmm. And we understand pretty well what the decline of those properties looks like. Then we have to think about what the strategy is, right? And this is where I think it's very complicated in this problem.
Is this where people get lost?
I think so. I think this is the step that most people just skip altogether and go right to the tactics. So they say, okay, I hear you on objectives. Now tell me how to eat, how to exercise, how to sleep, etc. And I think you can't skip this bucket. If you're playing, if you're asking questions that are straightforward, you don't really need a strategy. So if you said to me, Peter, my objective right now is not to get a sunburn, we don't need a major strategy. Like, it's relatively straight. We can go straight to tactics. You're going to avoid the sun altogether. If you need to be in the sun, you're going to wear long sleeves and a hat, and you're going to wear sunscreen and blah, blah, blah. And it's pretty straightforward. But when you say, my objective is to live 10 years longer than I otherwise would and do so at a much higher function, as evidenced by that list of things you just said, well, I can't just jump to tactics. They're not obvious. So instead, I have to go through a whole bunch of indirect measures because I don't have what I really want, right? What I really want is I'd love to be able to rely on the gold standard, which is randomized controlled experiments that would give me the answer. But for reasons that are self-evident and obvious and not worth explaining, we don't have randomized controlled experiments that answer all the questions that pertain to taking a 35-year-old and setting him up to be the best 95-year-old. So we have to have an option B. And option B really rests on a whole bunch of other pillars of strategic insight. So one of those things is, what are the inferences we can make from observational data of long-lived, well-functioned humans? So looking at the centenarians, for example, who we very quickly figure out are genetically gifted. So their superpower was picking the right parents, but we can still learn a lot from them. We'll put that aside for a moment. The other thing we can look at is short-term human studies that don't cover the hard outcome, such as the full duration of your life, but cover certain things. So for example, there might be hard outcome studies that look at heart disease or stroke, or hard outcomes that look at performance and functional metrics such as strength, resilience, and things like that. We then look at animal literature, or non-human literature, I think to be more accurate, that looks at the full duration outcome. So I think we can look at some of those animal studies and get a pretty good sense of what's affecting lifespan and health span. Then we want to look at mechanistic studies. So how can we understand, for example, the benefits of exercise when we look at the cellular level, when we understand them, when we look at proteomic, metabolomic changes of exercise, and what do those things tell us, as an example, about, say, exercise or sleep restriction or dietary restriction. And then the final tool that I think we look at in our strategy bucket is Mendelian randomization. So sometimes you actually let nature do the randomized controlled experiment for you. So Mendelian randomizations are very elegant types of studies where when you can find genes that are responsible for phenotypes of interest, you can ask the question, as nature shuffles those genes, do we establish causality by the outcome? So when you put all 5 of those together, that's how you start to cobble together what your tactics are. And that's the final piece of it. So what are your tactics? You basically have 5 domains. You have all things that pertain to what you eat, all things that pertain to how you exercise and move, how you sleep, all the drugs, molecules, supplements, hormones that you could possibly take, and then all the, call it the bucket of things that you would do to manage emotional and mental health.
When you break it down like that, longevity seems very simple, that you have these 5 key areas that you're focused on. Where are people focusing their attention, in your opinion, when it comes to both health span and lifespan longevity, that have the shortest levers, but people are giving undue attention to?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think what I find funny is that everybody, and I'm not sure, I know I've been guilty of this myself. It's very tempting to just focus on your favorite thing. Like there was a point in time where virtually all of my attention was focused on nutrition. Like I really felt that nutrition was the alpha and the omega of this entire equation. And all you had to do was sort of eat a certain way and everything was going to work itself out. Obviously, the medical establishment is hyper-focused on the medicine side of this, as evidenced by the fact that's the only thing we learned in medical school and residency, right? It's not like anybody taught you how to administer exercise or nutrition. Even if you knew that those things mattered, you had no education in how to actually do anything about it. So each entity, I think, just kind of has their own expertise. Where I stand today, I would say a lot of people are kind of majoring in the minor and minoring in the major when it comes to nutrition, is sort of a belief that I have. I think once you get beyond the real fundamentals of energy balance and protein intake, I honestly think a lot of people are spending too much time thinking about the finer details of it. And the evidence, at least at this point in time, is not really there in an overwhelming way to say that it matters a whole heck of a lot once you achieve that. In other words, there are multiple different ways to achieve energy balance, to achieve, adequate distribution of fats, macronutrients, and things like that. But the belief system that I once had, and that I think many others have, that, this exact ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 is what's essential. If that's true, it's not based on any evidence as of this time.